today. It's my great honor to welcome Rodney Sanchez, who's part of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship of Milwaukee. Rodney and I have got to know each other a little bit. We've both been part of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee, and you're part of the Committee on Interfaith Understanding, or have been,
Yep.
And so this is part of your life,
Yes.
in addition to your faith practice. And so look forward to hearing from you today, and hopefully we won't razz too many questions at the end. And so welcome, and it's great to have you with us. And so let's welcome Rodney Sanchez.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Matt. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I thought I'd bring along a bell, one of the bells we use to call us into meditation, kind of settle us into mindful awareness, present moment awareness. So I'm going to turn this off. So why don't we just take a moment to sit up tall in our chairs and have our feet flat on the ground. And we'll just take a moment to just kind of allow the morning to settle into the heart center. Just kind of feel your body sitting in the chair, maybe take a breath or two, but the main thing is to sit up straight, feet on the ground, and let's listen to the sound of this bell. This bell likes to keep going. Cool. Once again, it's great to be here. Really happy to be invited in and to spend some time chatting with you about just a little overview of Buddhism and some of the doctrine, some of the practices that the Buddha pointed us towards, and then a little bit about the history, and maybe perhaps also how interfaith practice, interfaith understanding, and interfaith engagement, how I view that as a would-be Buddhist coming into the community, and then leave some time for some question and answer too. So. It's interesting that we don't know exactly when the Buddha was born. We have a general idea, somewhere around 5th century BCE, so sometime about 500 or 600 years before the time of Christ. And he was born in what is now southern Nepal, into a family, or we could call it like a clan or a tribal structure in that part of the world. And at that time, the community that he was born into was it was kind of like a council where there wasn't a lot of hierarchy. There was elders, both men and women, that helped shape the decision making of the community. And it was before the kind of monarchy, kind of empire structure that started to rise up in that part of India. Just before that had moved over into that part of the world. So it was more of a, I don't want to call it, I don't know what to call it. I was going to say it was old school. It wasn't like this kind of top-down structure, which I think is important for how Buddhism came about and what he ended up teaching, seeing this kind of more egalitarian, more equal sharing of power between the sexes and between the whole clan. So when he was born, there were these great prophecies Like, he's either going to be an amazing spiritual guide or he's going to be a wonderful political leader. And the stories that come down to us are that his dad, Suddhodana, would prefer that he become a political leader. Yeah. And so as opposed to someone who's, like, at that time truly homeless and without possession and is the spiritual guide. And so the myth is that his dad shielded him from all, like, the bad, quote unquote, bad parts of the world. So he didn't get exposed to a lot of sickness or old age, illness. He was, like, brought up in this lap of what we might call sensual enjoyment, like the arts, music, sport, just everything that, the food and whatever you might conjure up in your imagination of what it was like way back when and what those luxuries would have been like. And so he shielded him from the city, from the world, because he didn't want him to be prompted by problems that might then shift his mind towards doing something on a spiritual level. And then the myth continues, and it's said that he and his friend Chanda, his attendant and lifelong companion, they stole away and went out into the town. And the Buddha saw these 4 messengers, which were crucial for his awakening to go out on the road and try to find a way out of suffering. And those 4 things are, he saw someone who was old, someone who was sick, and he saw a death scene, or like a family that was carrying a body to a funeral pyre, and then he saw a wandering mendicant. So he saw a wandering spiritual person, a holy person, so to speak. And he's asking Chanda, his buddy, so what is this? What is this old person, that's moving along and gray and shuffling and whatnot? And Chanda said, well, this is just the way of things. We all grow old. And same with the illness, the person who was ill, what is happening here? What is going on? And well, it's just, we all experience this, Chanda said. We all experience illness and so on. And then there's the death scene where the family is carrying the body on the stretcher down to the river where the funeral pyre is set up, which is a traditional way of cremation in that part of the world. And the family is lamenting and wailing and sobbing, and there's all this suffering and sadness around that. And again, this is just the way of things. We all human beings, all things end up passing on in some way. And then there was the wandering mendicant that goes by, who appears to be in this place of kind of peace and contentment. And Chanda says something like, yeah, there are many people that give up the worldly life, so to speak, and take the robes of a mendicant and wander about and get alms for the food and try to find a way out of the pain of the world. And so the myth is important and it's powerful, and I always wonder how it could have been possible that he hadn't seen those things by the time he was in his 20s. But the story itself is powerful. Those 4 messengers then prompted Siddhartha, the future Buddha, to renounce his life as a householder, to renounce his life with his wife and his newborn son, and his inheritance of being the leader of the clan. And he left all that behind and went out in search of a way to find a way out of suffering for himself, for all sentient beings. And to back up just a second, it's important to remember that in the mind of that mythos, in the mind of that part of the world, there's a belief in what we can call rebirth. That when this body dies, that when this body stops, something continues. Like we might call it mind. The word soul that we might use in a Christian context, I don't think is. It could be, we could kind of use that word, but I think it's different. But the main thing is that life continues. Something continues. We're reborn again in another body. So this is this endless cycle of taking a body, being in this world, having to deal with all the stuff we have to deal with, and then we die, and then we do it all over again in some form or another. So there's this cycle of rebirth that was part of the thinking of the points of view of that part of the world. So thinking in those terms, like the illness, the growing old, the dying, the being reborn over and over. It's like, yeah, is there maybe another way? Is there a way out of all this so-called suffering? So the Buddha set off. The Buddha set off to try to find a way out, and he went and learned from all the known spiritual guides in that area in that time. Learned all the meditative techniques they had to offer, and he reached these really rarefied states of consciousness, understandings of body and meditation, but still he hadn't found what he was looking for. Because, like, imagine your most incredible experience you've ever had. Like, whether it's sitting in the church and feeling overwhelmed by the Gospels, or sitting at a performance, at a play, or a musical show, or being out in nature and just like that kind of feeling, or falling in love for the first time, your babies are being born, whatever it might be, that this kind of ecstatic, just wonderful aspect of life, then it feels so good and it's so powerful. And then at some point, though, it stops, right? It ends. It doesn't last forever. So he would be in these meditative states of just like sheer bliss. But then at some point, the meditation would end and he'd be back in the body, back, talking with people at the church and being around, dealing with life. And so he wasn't satisfied with what he was learning. So he set off on his own. He set off on his own and went out into the forest. And he decided what he'd do first was to deny the physical experience. And he went into extreme asceticism. So when he grew up, he was in the lap of luxury. He had everything that possibly you can imagine in the physical realm. Clothes, food, partners, dance, music, sport, everything you could possibly imagine. And he left that. And now he's moving towards the opposite extreme of asceticism, or denying the body, in the sense of going deep into the forest and being in the most darkest, scariest places, not washing his clothes, not washing his body, not eating very much at all. The myth says he got himself down to surviving on 1 sesame seed a day. Sesame seeds are powerful. And tahini is great. Like, one reason why hummus is so wonderful, chickpeas and sesame seeds, like together, complete protein, excellent food. But 1 sesame seed a day, that seems pretty extreme. And so roasted or not, it's still just one. Right? And so when you grind it with even a little salt and make a little damasio, it's still just that 1 seed. And so it's like, oh my gosh. And then, so the fateful day happens where he's wondering what, this is not working. And he's going along this path, and he falls over, and he's like, lying there decrepit, near death. And fortunately, Sujata, a village girl in the village nearby, was going out into the forest with an offering of like porridge, rice porridge, buttermilk, something, to make an offering to the tree spirits. And she comes across Siddhartha passed out on the path. And so she bends down and she offers him some food. And he takes the food. And right away, as soon as he takes the food, his mind is brighter and he feels his body reviving. And he gets the sense of, I need my body to be healthy, because he's noticing what's happening in his mind and in his heart after all this extreme practice. And he also has this memory of when he was a kid, and there was this plowing ceremony, like a plowing ritual, where it's the beginning of spring and all the people are going out to the fields, and there's this music and dance and festooned oxen, and all these things are happening as they're breaking, they're plowing the fields for the first time. And it's a really hot day. He's like about 10, and he's getting a little bit heated up. And so he goes over under this rose apple tree and sits down, and he instantly comes into this place of mindfulness, of peace, the cool breeze in the shade of the tree, and he's not even quote unquote trying, and he gets into this place of just like of calm, of balance. And he remembers that, and it's like, oh yeah. So actually when the conditions of life were quite pleasant, being outside, being in the shade of the tree, being out with friends and whatnot, yeah, this kind of peacefulness came. So that memory, along with what he's feeling when he eats this porridge, is a big aha moment for him. And so he starts to eat. After this point, every day after that, he starts to bathe, he starts to get himself clean and do exercises. And at this point, he had been out doing this ascetic practice with some friends, with 5 friends, and they're watching Siddhartha bathing and eating and exercising. Like, Siddhartha has lost it. He's given up the path, because they were following him, and they got so disgusted they left. They left him alone. And so then at that point, Siddhartha starts to focus in and examine what later became the middle way, be known as the middle way. So a lot of what Buddhist practice is finding that middle way between the things that we like and we don't like, between the political situation that we have now, where's the middle way between this left and the right? There are many times we don't get what we want, or we get separated from the things that we have. Life just happens, right? So how do we find that middle way between the extremes of pleasure and the denial of the body? Like, to use that metaphor that we have going here with the way his life worked. He's got dad provided everything, he left that, he denied everything, left that. Neither one of them in and of themselves are neither good nor bad, let's say, but there's something in the middle. There's some way to navigate life where we don't get buffeted around by what we like and dislike. Because we will get sick, and we will grow old, and we will die. This is just life. It's like one thing that he did was zero in all of his attention and his ability to focus and concentrate and look at this very life. What is going on in this very life? How is nature working? How do we work inside? How do we work in relation to nature? And how can we find peace within all that coming and going and flow of things? And so for me, this is one of the great gifts that he offered the world, was a lot of practices around how to be mindful of what is going on inside and mindful of what's going on outside. And notice how we navigate through that. That's where the peace of mind is. That's where the peace is. To digress a moment here, I'm a professional, well, I'm not professional, I'm a serious Frisbee player. And my wife Bethany and I met at a Frisbee tournament in California. And we were at a Frisbee tournament in Virginia this past weekend. It's an annual thing, the 42nd annual Virginia State overall Frisbee Championships. And I have, I've got various ailments at 57, I've got I have ailments. And my knee got inflamed at this event. And so luckily the sensation was dull for most of the time. And then by the time it got sharp and was telling me to shut down, I'd already done everything I needed to do. So that was good timing. Then I come back and I go to my chiropractor friend, who's like an incredible helper, and he's working on my knee, and he's doing what he does. And at the end of the session, he starts to bring the elbow out, and he's got the elbow in my leg here, working on the fascia and the muscle that feels like a crumpled up rubber band. And it was not a pleasant sensation. It was a very sharp sensation, one that was unpleasant. But through my memory and mindfulness and knowing what happens when I see Dr. Bernie, that I knew that this sensation, although unpleasant, was quite beneficial, was going to be beneficial. So then I'm bringing this up because I don't want to have a knee injury. I don't want to have Dr. Bernie digging his elbow into my leg, but this is the reality of my life this week. This is what is happening. So how do I then navigate the likes and the dislikes? I love playing Frisbee. I met my wife on the Frisbee field. We've been together for 27 years now. And it also does things to my body that can be detrimental. And so how do I work through that? And so this is what the Buddha was aiming us to investigate. Like that sensation of Bernie digging into my leg isn't there anymore. It was over quickly. So in the time while it's going, I can meditate, I can come to my breath, and I can work on what's going on up here. Oh God, this hurts so much. I wish he wasn't doing it. Like that thought, get it out of there. And just try to be with the sheer experience of the thing itself. So this is what the Buddha is kind of partly asked us to do, be with the sheer experience of life, the actual thing itself, and watch the kind of stories that we build around it. Because the stories are just stories, yeah? It's like, oh, I like this, I don't like that. These are stories that aren't necessarily that thing, the thing itself, whatever it is, the injury, the sunshine, the snow. And who was stoked when it snowed on like April 15th? I loved to shovel, and it was hard for me to go out and shovel that day because something wasn't right. Something wasn't right. So then I did shovel eventually though, because it's a civic duty and all that. So the Buddha, after Sujata gave him the food and so on, he started to get himself healthy again, and he sat under the Pipala tree, which later became known as the Bodhi tree, or the tree of enlightenment. Bodhi is a word that means awake. And he sat there, and he resolved not to get up until he'd found a way out of the predicament of suffering. And he did that, and he awoke, they say, he awoke to the truth of Dharma, or the truth of nature. And this is something that is just here for us to investigate. So the teachings that he offered, the way he set up frameworks for how to look at what he had woke up to, or things that he concocted, but the truth of Dharma, or the way things are, the truth of nature, is something that's just here. He woke up to a path that had just been covered up for a while. And to me, this is another really helpful aspect of what the Buddha taught, given like where I came from in my life, and maybe also how it might work with interfaith work, like how we can work together. So he woke up to the truth that things are in a state of constant change or impermanent. So all physical, all mental phenomena, everything in nature is of the nature of change. It's impermanent. None of it lasts forever. And it's also woven together in what Martin Luther King Jr. called a garment of mutuality. It's woven together in a conditioned way, in an interdependent way that is so complex and profound. It's, you have to like get into string theory or quantum physics or something like that to like really dig in to see what it's about. So this is the way nature works. It's like a flow through, it's a constant movement of energy, so to speak, of causes and conditions. Yet we as humans tend to think of it as the other way. That it appears that we're separate, right? All of us here in our bodies and the chairs and the carpet and the needlework and all this stuff. That we're separate and solid and everlasting, like things will last forever. And that we'll find our happiness in those things. And we cling on to those things as I, me, and mine. So this is the heart of the matter, like how we relate to all the things that we come across, whether it's physical or mental. We hold on to them as mine, or yours. And those are yours, this is mine. And this ultimately gets us into all sorts of trouble, because desire rises, hatred rises out of that ignorance. And that's where the suffering comes from. Like, I don't want this knee to be like this. Wah. Wah. So like, I don't want this knee to be like this, and wah wah are not the knee injury. It's coming out of my own choice, out of my own mind, and I'm creating more tension, I'm creating more stress by my own response to the knee. So I'm trying to bring that up as an example of how the Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, is about this very present moment process. So in this aspect, it's somewhat different than other religions. Absolutely, you're being taught ways of the gospel and the teachings of Christ and the commentators that came after that of how to live this very life, how to be in this world. Yeah. So in that case, in that situation, there's a lot of similarity between, I think, all the religions. But when it comes to like the kind of metaphysics, there's quite a big difference. And so the fact that there's not like a creator and separate creator God posited in Buddhism, so that's something that's quite different, I think, from theistic religions. Let me back up again. So then back to this moment of noticing how things are really working. To notice that the change is coming all the time. I'm going to keep getting older. My knee is going to get better. It's going to get worse, better, worse, better, worse, that kind of thing. That's just what happens. Yeah. So then how do I work in a way to find peace amongst all that flow? So the Buddha woke up to this understanding of nature and where suffering comes from. And then when he was in this place of like calm and bliss, he walked and meditated, walking meditation, sitting meditation for about 6 weeks, just kind of hanging out in mindfulness, hanging out in this place of not creating ego. Imagine that, not creating any ego, not clinging to anything so that we're like, I don't know how to say it, we're not worrying, we're not anxious, we're not stressed about anything. Life is just kind of flowing, and we're not creating identity around any of it. And he's like, how am I supposed to, no one's gonna get this, he's saying to himself. How can I talk about this? How can I teach this? It seems so subtle. And the myth is that Indra, who is the main god in the pantheon of the gods of that part of the world, like now he's very important Hindu god. Hinduism and Buddhism are both German terms. It's not, anyway, that's a whole other topic. That's a whole other topic. That was like the 18th century, I think, is when these terms got coined. But Indra comes out and says, look, Siddhartha, the Buddha, there are people that will understand you. And he was urged by the gods to teach because they see the suffering that's happening on our little earth realm. So he ends up going out to teach, and he you wonder, like, how did he know where to go? But he went and he found his friends, his ascetic friends. Like maybe he's omniscient, he's the Buddha. He doesn't need social media. He doesn't need like the Pony Express. I don't know how he knew where to go, but he went and he found his friends, and he gave the first talk that we call the turning of the wheel of Dharma. He set the teachings in motion. So he's, imagine you've abandoned this guy who started to eat and drink and bathe himself where you were, like on this extreme ascetic path, and he comes approaching up, and they're like, oh, here comes Siddhartha, here comes the slacker. Let's ignore him because he's just left. And he shows up, and like in all these stories, you read from the point of view of the devotees. The Buddha's radiant. He's got this certain aura about him, and they instantly start to clear space for him, give him a seat, wash his feet, take care of him. And he sits down and he gives this first talk. I have found the middle way between the extremes of, like I said, annihilation or eternalism, likes and dislikes, whatever kind of set of opposites you want to have. I have found this middle way. And that very path, middle way, is the Eightfold Path. So when he first talked and first spoke, he gave these teachings that are central to all the schools of Buddhism, and certainly in the southern areas of the world now where Buddhism is alive and well, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Laos, Cambodia. The Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path, these early teachings are essential. And the Four Noble Truths are this formula where there is suffering. So there's a misconception, and sometimes it gets translated as that life is suffering, or all life is suffering, but that's actually not a correct translation of the text. It's there is suffering, and that suffering has a cause. Because we are ignorant to the nature of reality, we tend to cling to things in either desire or hatred. Or like we want to hold on to this thing, or we want to push that thing away. So there's aversion, and then there's this wanting. And because we do that, we end up having this spiritual disease, or we suffer because of it. Because we're denying this part of life, and we're running after this part of life, and both of these things are impermanent, right? The knee injury is impermanent, the Frisbee tournament's impermanent, this talk's impermanent, right? So to think that we're going to find ultimate peace out of our gathering here, that this is going to last forever, we're going to go, whatever, the barbecues are going to happen, we're all going to always be together. That's just not wise thinking. Yeah. And then the third noble truth, very important, there's a quenching to the suffering. There is a quenching to the suffering, and the fourth noble truth, the path that leads to the quenching of suffering, which is the Eightfold Path. So it's really important to think about these four things as cause and effect. Because of this, we suffer. Because of this, we don't suffer. Yeah? This is like this, because this is like this. This is Buddhist causality. This is like this, because this is like this. Because this arises, this arises. When this ceases, this ceases. And I use the word this because, from every point of view, whatever, this mic, this shirt, this piece of paper. These things rise up because of certain causes and conditions, and they abide for a while. Then they fall apart due to causes and conditions. This is just the way nature works, right? So when we can see how this is flowing and understand that this flow can be observed and we can condition that flow, because through mindfulness, through meditation, we start to see things more clearly. We take a look at life, we start to see how things are working, then we start to make choices. So I said before that we have ignorance or delusion, just kind of not seeing clearly, and then the greed and the hatred that rises from that. So with mindfulness practice, with the path in mind, we can set our mind on generosity, love, and compassion. So rather than just ignoring life and being greedy and being hateful, we can cultivate generosity, love, and compassion. So this is the second of the Eightfold Path, right thinking. So we have a viewpoint. Let me just run through this real quick. So there's right view or skillful, wise understanding, which is noticing that the Four Noble Truths are functioning the way that I just described and that how nature works. And with that kind of viewpoint, with that understanding, then thinking comes next. Wise, skillful thinking, cultivating love, compassion, generosity. And then wise, skillful speech, helpful and kind speech. Wise, skillful action, non-harming. That's one of the central aspects of path, is vowing to abstain from harming sentient beings, or do the least amount of harming that we can, right? It's impossible to not harm things. Even if you're vegetarian and you're watching where you're walking, it's impossible not to. I might have hit a bird driving over here today. All of a sudden I looked and there was the coo, and it's and I looked in the rearview mirror and the thing might have flown away. But I didn't want to have that happen, but it's possible that, sometimes it's just hard to abstain. Then right livelihood, having a job that helps rather than harms beings. Right effort, which is cultivating the wholesomeness, cultivating those wholesome qualities that you have inside, cultivating unwholesome qualities you haven't yet cultivated, and then working on the habits that we know bring us problems. Like whenever we're unskillful or unwholesome, taking a good, wise, clear look at how we live our lives and working to transform and stop doing those things. So effort, and then mindfulness and concentration are the last two of the list. So cultivating samadhi, or an ability to concentrate, and then mindfulness, so we can pay attention and see things as clearly as possible. So that's the foundation of the doctrine, is that there's the Four Noble Truths. This is the formula, the framework through which you can look at life and learn how to alleviate what we might call the spiritual disease, alleviate that place inside that basically our own choices, our own mind, our own heart, of what gets us into trouble. Yeah? And then here's this Eightfold Path. Here's all these practices that we can do. It's given to us in a list, but they, as I said, nothing is separate. Everything is interdependent, so they all weave amongst each other. Yeah. So then as a lay person in Buddhism, you're asked to take refuge in the Triple Gem and to take on the 5 precepts. So the refuge is, there's the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha. The Buddha, the person that woke up and showed the way, and also the Buddha that's possible, that's within each one of us, our own ability to wake up. I don't think that you use this terminology, but it's kind of how does the Christ mind function within you? How do you cultivate that? How does the path of the Gospels, the love that comes to fulfill the law, if I'm getting my scripture correct, how does that live inside of you, right? Take refuge in that. So you might take refuge in Jesus as this amazing teacher, then also how does Jesus and the teachings live inside of you? So that's the same for us. Refuge in the Buddha because he showed the way and I have trust in that, and then refuge also in this ability for myself to wake up. And then the Dharma are the teachings, again, the teachings that are pointing the way, and as they live inside, And Sangha is community. So taking refuge in the communities that we gather with, Buddhists or otherwise, that are working for peace and awakening in society, and then my connection to them inside. So taking refuge in that, and then vowing to follow the 5 precepts, which are very simple moral instructions: to abstain from killing, abstain from stealing, abstain from sexual misconduct, abstain from lying, and abstain from taking intoxicants that cloud the mind and cause heedlessness. So that's like pretty normal ethical injunctions that we're asked to work with. So that's like a thumbnail sketch of what it means for us as lay people to just become, I tend to get a little flip, but become a member of the team. And so when people come to our Sangha, to our community that we host, my wife and I host, we make it clear that you don't need to join the team to come and sit with us and practice and learn about these teachings. Because for me, they are things that we do at its best. The teachings of the Buddha are things that we do in this very life, in this body. It's not about the words on the paper. It's not about whether or not we believe in rebirth or whether or not there's God or not. To me, the main thing, and this is where I think it's really helpful for my interfaith understanding, is that the main thing is how we get along. How do we treat each other? How do we live with each other? So this is what the Buddha was asking us to do. This is what all the great religions are asking us to do, is to live a certain way. Whether it's through love, compassion, service, generosity, all these wonderful virtues of the heart that we all are, I think we're all here today because of something related to that. You all are coming to church for something. I'm assuming some of it is related to those things I just said. So then the Buddha was, as I said, lived in what is now southern Nepal and northern India. And then after, he lived for about 40 years after he woke up. So he taught for 40 years. And we have a voluminous amount of texts. It's like the opposite of what happened in your tradition. Jesus, whatever we're going to call it, woke up, did his thing, and taught for a very short time before the crucifixion. And in Buddhism, it's kind of the opposite. He woke up, there's all these years of teaching. And then slowly, the Buddhism is spread throughout South and East Asia, and what's now Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and up to the east into Japan, the upper Near East. Japan, China, South and North Korea, Tibet, Mongolia. And no matter where it's gone, Buddhism has taken on the flavor of the culture, because there's no central authority the way there is in some of the other religions. There's one reason why there's such a broad expression of teachings and images and whatnot is that the core, the truth of nature, the teachings are quite, they shift depending on the culture and the landscape of where they land. And then sometime, I would say in the 1800s, through immigration, is when Buddhism started to come to North America and Europe, into the Caucasian world. Chinese and Japanese immigrants, certainly coming onto this continent. The Buddha Dharma came to this continent mostly through a lot of the Japanese that came into California. And then in the mid-20th century, people started to seek other ways of being. And so lots of travelers and seekers of the 50s and 60s went off to India to learn about Buddhism. European Americans, and they came back, and it's been slowly growing on this continent. It's the 4th largest religion that's in the world today. It's about 7% of the population of the world. 520 million people are Buddhists. It's funny to think about that, 520 million. It's only 7% of that, of the population, but the 4th largest religion. And hopefully I've said enough to pique your interest. I'm going to make sure there's time for Q&A. So we have about 20 minutes left or so. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'd like to open it up to the floor to see if there's any questions. Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a daughter who spent 2 years in China, and she came home and said, I want to be a Lutheran Buddhist.
Yes.
So I thought I'd better start studying up on this stuff.
Oh, good, good.
You know, and so one of the places it began was this Theravada Mahayana. They're two different, is that correct?
You said?
Theravada and
yes.
Mahayana.
That's right, right.
So where would you say you're on that spectrum?
So this reminds me of something I wanted to mention. And I was listening to Garrison Keillor one night when he was doing Prairie Home still, and he was talking about a friend of his in, I don't know if it was Lake Wobegon or where it was, and he was someone who came over from India, and he really liked going to church with his friends, and he became a Hinduthran. So, right, there's a lot of Jubus out there, and, whatever the Catholic Buddhist thing is, like the
we're big into mindfulness now.
Right, or the Catholic Buddhas or whatever. So one thing that I like to think about is to go back to what I said about, like, Jesus asks us to practice unconditional love, right? Like to love our enemies the way you love me, like the way you love Christ, to love your enemies. So, and then he died. So there wasn't any, there's not, I don't know if I remember from reading the book, there's not a lot of instruction in there on how to do it, right? So I think within the Buddhist teachings, there's a whole bunch of instruction around how to cultivate a mind of unconditional love, based on just that, without doctrine, without religion, how to do that. Like all this teachings around mindfulness, the teachings of meditation, how we can develop our mind to actually focus in on the Gospels and live that life of love. So and then to get to your question, so like hewing those things together to me can be done very easily, being a Lutheran Buddhist. As long as, especially if you leave the metaphysics aside, at some point there's going to be, if you get into the nitty gritty of of like God and self and soul, then there will be separation. But when it comes to how we live our life, I don't think there's much. So in the southern part of the Buddhist world, there's what is now the Theravada tradition. And Theravada tradition is a tradition that looks to the earlier record of the teachings, the Pali text. So when Buddhism was first written down some 300 or 400 years after the Buddha died, so it was an oral tradition up to that point, things were written down in this language called Pali. And in the Pali text is where a lot of the Theravadins get, that's where their reference point is. And then later there was another turning of the wheel of Dharma, and there was a reaction to kind of what was going on in the Buddhist world, and the Mahayana was born. And they have a different set of texts, although they're looking still at the same person, the Buddha, as the inspiration. And they have there's a different kind of way that they go about doing things. They talk about the Bodhisattva, who is the enlightened being. Bodhi is awake or enlightened, and Sattva is being. So the Bodhisattva is someone who is on a path to live a life for the benefit of all sentient beings. And they choose to be reborn over and over again until all of us are awake. This is like this incredible kind of aspiration that is made in the Mahayana tradition. But it gets a lot more complicated than that. But yeah, there is these two different ways of thinking about it, or like two different ways, or more than two, but these two that you could go into as frameworks, basically doing the same thing. You had a question.
Yeah, I was going to ask about how you came to, what did you say, practice Buddhism, or how do you phrase that and how you came to it?
So I was born a nun, an N-O-N-E, which is something that the Interfaith Cabinet is, I think, is a challenge for us, is that I was not born into a tradition. My parents grew up in the Methodist Church, but by the time I was born, they had stopped going to church. So I was raised a Californian, that's my religion. That's always a good one, right? So my ancestors come from Scotland, Germany, Holland, and Spain. So there's this mixture on both sides of the family. And these people came to this continent, and then they slowly moved and intermingled and came to Southern California, where my parents were born. Then they moved to Northern California, where I was born. So I grew up and I don't think my story is unusual for Americans, but I was born on this continent without any kind of European tradition, almost none whatsoever, including the church. So I was someone who's a nun, someone who doesn't have a religious tradition. And then growing up in the Bay Area, there's all sorts of things in the air, you know. Like there was a lot of Asians that already moved there. Buddhism was just something that was like talked about from time to time. I was a big fan of Kung Fu, the TV show, as a kid. That was a big highlight in our growing up in the '70s. And you know, the sight of him wandering around the West with just, you know, barefoot with just a bag, that was like romantic to me. I thought that was a good thing. Yeah, that looked like a good life to me anyway. And then, yes, that bag could carry in frisbees. So someone said. The frisbee would fit in that bag. See, the frisbee could be as a ball too. Okay, like do my arms round into the frisbee, eat my meal out of the frisbee, and play catch with it. It's a very utilitarian item. And then I think ultimately what really turned me were these conversations that Bill Warner's had with Joseph Campbell. So these were on PBS in the late '80s. And Joseph Campbell, if you've not heard of him, Hero of a Thousand Faces, The Power of Myth, he was a very well-versed mythologist and study of religions. And he really was kind of like boiling things down and talking about things in ways that touched me. And I also had hurt myself really bad playing Frisbee, and I couldn't play Frisbee anymore, and so suffering was the entry point, which is not unusual. Like, oh, how do I deal with this? Like, my life has been flipped upside down. So that's a long answer, but that's kind of how it happened. What else? Yes, please.
Can you tell me the differences? Now there's the Shambhala temple on the east side, and then there's one on 76th and Blue Mountain, whose name I can never pronounce. What are the
We have the
differences?
Nichiren by Buzet.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So as Buddhism moved around the world, all these different flavors and ways to go about practicing happened in all those places. And now here we are in North America, in the United States of America, where all people from all over the world have come here, and they've brought their cultural traditions with them. So on this continent, like all the schools of Buddhism are here, and it can be kind of, if you're interested in exploring, it can be kind of confusing. Like, who do I choose? How do I do it? Because they look so totally different. So the Shambhala path is something that was created through the imagination of someone named Trungpa Rinpoche. And he was a Tibetan monk who came to the United States, started Naropa University in Boulder, and so had all these Tibetan Buddhist teachings, but also then came up with this idea for a secular path of enlightened society. So he saw what he thought was needed for us and created a secular pathway, utilizing all these Buddhist teachings as a way to work on enlightened society. You know, for those that the religion, just like the nuns, the people that are allergic to religion for whatever reason. The Nichirens on 76 in Blue Mountain, I don't know too much about, but I know that it's a Japanese practice, and they do a lot of chanting as part of their meditation, and it is a sect of Buddhism that a lot of African Americans are drawn to. I don't know if anyone saw the movie about Tina Turner that Angela Bassett was in, and when she's dealing with Ike and she turns to Buddhism and she's got that altar and she's chanting, that's the Nichirens, that's the same group that's on 76 in Blue Mountain. And then there are ethnic temples in town. There's a Lao temple, a Vietnamese temple, a Thai temple. Then there's several other of us, what you might call converts in town. And we kind of are all over, we cover the range of practice. And for me, I'm trying to figure out what is the actual hardcore essence of what the Buddha taught. So, you know, I don't want to jump the culture because I think the culture is important, but how does this culture do it? How do we do it, so to speak, as European Americans? How does the Buddhism come through our bodies? How do we express ourselves? So part of my journey is trying to find what is the actual essence of what the Buddha taught, and then go from there. So Buddha-yana is something that, yana, this word yana means vehicle. So Mahayana is a greater vehicle. Buddha-yana is a Buddha vehicle. Yeah, one and then two, yes.
I know this
concept came out of India, and I don't know if it's part of your practice or part of Hindu, and probably people have never heard the acoustic record. Now, the acoustic record, according to this thought, is everything that has happened to humankind since the beginning is in a cloud around the earth and in the universe. And there is no second life, but there are people that can tap into it to see what has happened in the past. One of those people, when I was talking to Dave Holmes this morning, was George Patton. He would stand on a battlefield and he would tell his aide-de-camp, "I've been here." And he knew what would work and what didn't work in the past, because his mind could tap into this acoustic record and he could see what had happened. For instance, Robert the Martel Hammer turning back the Muslims in the year 760. He could see how this worked, or the other battles that had taken place. When he stood on a battlefield, something that had happened there in the past, his mind could tap into this record and see these things. He didn't actually live then, but he could see what had happened. Is this something that is Buddhist, or is this Hindu? Or I know this concept came out of India. I've watched this on a number of stations on History Channel.
Yeah, no, the main answer is I don't know.
Oh.
That's the first time I've heard this specific thing, and I'm so much sure where it comes from.
Like, who was that, what actress that she said she lived in a time during the Assyrian Empire? She's a famous movie actress.
Shirley MacLaine.
Yeah, Shirley MacLaine, yeah. That she had lived another
Right.
life.
You know, past lives. I don't know. I don't know, because I haven't experienced it myself.
Snoopy and Lucy love to look at the cloud.
Yeah. Yeah, they talk about the computer cloud today. Everything that you've done on your computer is out there in a cloud.
It's on a server somewhere.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Well, I was just curious if you could speak more about in the Eightfold Path about right living, because I was under the impression that some Buddhist sects attribute that to like the collecting of alms for a livelihood, but you phrased it as like living that doesn't hurt or harm.
Right. So traditionally as a monastic, you are, one of the words that is used for the monastic can be translated as homeless. So in the time of the Buddha, and depending on how you want to live traditionally or not, because once you set up a temple, once you set up a building, once you set up a shop, so to speak, like as a monastery, then life is different than living in the forest, right? So if you're living in the forest, if you're wandering around, then I think you had I think it was 2 or 3 robes, maybe just 2 robes, bowl, something to clean your teeth with. There was only the items that you owned were very, very minimal. And then you went on alms rounds, and the Dharma was exchanged. So generosity, or dana, D-A-N-A, is an old term that predates Buddhism, that it's a very important part of for instance, what my wife and I are trying to do, but also how the early practice worked, is that I would come to the house and stand there as a monk or a nun and wait and see if anyone came out. If they didn't, then I moved to the next house. And if people come out to put food in the bowl, then there might be an exchange of teachings too. Like I would talk about the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha with you as you offered me the food. And this is one reason why the Buddha did not say, even though non-harming was key to what he taught, he did not say that we needed to be vegetarians. Because he didn't want to force the lay people to have to provide a certain type of food for the monastics. Like if you're in certain parts of the world, and how much, depending on what your life, what your resources are, you just might not be able to provide. You just provide what you can. So there's that. Maybe as a monastic, you live a very much a life of homelessness, and you're reading very, very simple. My understanding in the translation of right livelihood is that to have, as a lay person, as a householder, as a non-monastic, is to have a job or have a livelihood that does not cause, just to gloss it this way, does not cause any unnecessary harm. It's like to have a job that helps and does not harm sentient beings. So like working for the weapons industry, or I suppose working for certain chemical industries even, or, there's like, maybe some, I'll stop. I don't want to get myself in trouble.
There's not many Buddhist exterminators.
Right, like working for Baxter, right, pest control, right. Or like you could be, depending on, so that's the thing about the awakening mind, maybe like the most compassionate person out there might be the Baxter person that is like praying and chanting over the termites as helping them move on to whatever's coming next in a really skillful way. You know what I mean? So like for me, it's pointing me towards the nonprofit sector. So I'm trying to at least have some kind of a job that has a mission that's trying to do something beneficial in the community. So that's one way that I interpret that right livelihood thing. And so the thing about that is also, like if we're leading a life that's wholesome or that's skillful, that's ethical, then when we come into stillness, we don't have these these thoughts of like, oh God, I said that to that person. I swore, I cut them off, I flipped the bird, I squished that bug, I was hateful to that person. Like these thoughts will come up in meditation, if that's what we're doing, right? But if we're not, if we're living a life of like I said, of as much wholesomeness as we can, then we come to meditate, it's easier to get into a calm state. It's easier to settle. So it's a big package. It's a big package that really works well together. And then the livelihood is part of that. Yeah,
Can you speak about Zen meditation and how that relates? Is that primarily the mindfulness aspect?
I have not done very much training in Zen. So I think traditional Zen, I think that they don't even use the breath as an object. I think they just sit there and watch. Sit and watch. When's he going to stop talking? What's for lunch? Blue's eggs is tasty. Now that you brought that up, now I'm thinking about that sauce. There's one too.
So the Buddha, he achieved his enlightenment when he was outside or underneath a tree. You mentioned that being outside. Do you think that's an important feature of meditation, to be outside as opposed to inside?
Certainly the Buddha was born under a tree. He woke up under a tree. He lived under a tree and trees, and he died under a tree. He was a forest person. His mom came from a great line of a matriarchal line where there's this Rubini's grove that had forest spirits, feminine energies that were watching over the clan. So it was certainly a huge part of his life, being out in nature. And one of the benefits I've found from meditating in nature is that you can see what I've been talking about it more clearly, the coming and going of things. You can never put your finger in the same river twice, right? Because you put it in there and then you take it out and you put it in, it's already different. This is one of the great teachings that we get from being in nature. So there's that. But in our world today, I'm sure many people have woken up sitting in a room. So there's just, depending on the cosmic conditions which we find ourselves in, I don't want to say, oh, Don, I'm sorry, you can't, meditation's not for you, because you live in the city, and there's no trees around your yard. You might as well just, whatever, go to Netflix. Because you might as well just enjoy yourself while you can, because there's no trees. So I think it really just depends on where we are and what we're doing. I encourage us all, just as a healthy thing to do, to go outside, go to the parks, enjoy the parks in town, go be outside and listen to the birds, bundle up in winter, enjoy being outside, because I think it's a healthy endeavor. And then if we're into meditation, doing it outside can be a beneficial thing, but not the
requirement.
Not the requirement, yeah.
Is the Dalai Lama to Buddhists like the Pope is to Catholics, or is it a different kind of relationship?
It's different, yeah. So the Dalai Lama is the head of he used to be the head of the Tibetan state and the head of the religion. I don't think he's the head of the state anymore. But those things were always yoked together. So in Tibetan Buddhism, it's very similar to Islam, where the religion and the politics are yoked, which can be quite helpful depending. So I think for Tibetans, he is the source of authority. But within Buddhism, there's not one entity or thing or place or organization, administrative structure that is on top of all of it. It's all just based on different sects.
Okay.
So it's 9:46, 10:46. Are there any other quick questions, or do we call it a?
I think we'll call it a.
All right. Well, thanks so much
Thank you.
for being in the body.